this. Ms. Terry and then Mr. Brown.
Good morning.
Morning.
Oops, am I on? Push the red one.
You're on.
Okay, couldn't hear myself. Melinda Terry. I'm going to wear my Central Valley Flood Control Association hat for this. But first of all, yes, I want to thank you. I think adding the Central Valley Flood Protection Board is really important. It's not only the fact that they have responsibility for some of the funding of the subventions program and approve those projects, but in fact, they are the entity. A lot of people get confused and think that the Department of Water Resources, because they have a flood division, are in charge of these facilities called the State Plan of Flood Control. But in fact, it is the Central Valley Flood Protection Board who gave the assurances to the federal government to maintain those facilities. And I do encourage any of you, I was going to read some of them, but I won't, but for Judge Burrell and the chair in particular, sometimes when you read the court cases that go on, there's a lot of factual stuff that you'll find. And the most relevant case that everyone talks about and that DWR fears the most is the Paterno Law case, which I have here. And this document in the first couple pages really does a good job of describing why the state lost and is now, it was an $800 million lawsuit loss. They settled for a little over $400 million. Every year the legislature has to allocate money to payment of that lawsuit. And essentially it is because if you agree to take over, even though you didn't build those facilities, but you've now agreed to take them over and assume responsibility, now you're responsibility for that failure. And that includes the bypasses. And as I've said many times here before, your plan has a lot of habitat projects in it. We talk about the FERPA, and the Delta Restoration Network was here about the framework they're working on, and the biological opinions and BDCP projects that are all similar and or the same. And almost all of those actually modify this state plan of flood control for which the board is now responsible. The agencies that I represent, the local maintaining agencies, they don't have the liability, the board does. We just agree as a local to maintain it for them. They're the ones that decide whether the projects go forward. And when I talk about that mitigation in the future, so anyway, if those habitat projects, if they're moving levees, breaching them, this case talked about a lot of the seepage and erosion as being part of that problem. If you recall, after the Independent Science boat tour, I had talked about the open water often creates that for the adjacent levees, the erosion and seepage that starts occurring. And that's where you get that liability, and we really need to make sure that they are at the table because ultimately they will do permits. Our local agencies will do permits. So I do encourage you to figure out how to get some kind of representation for the locals at some point, whether it's through a work group or the Corps, but I really am glad to see that they are on the Corps committee. Yesterday, my association had a board of directors meeting, and it was interesting because a lot of the discussion was over the Sutter bypass, which is north of the Delta, but again, the state plan of flood control, the levees work because we have these outlets for water known as these flood bypasses. And in the case of the Sutter bypass, they had a conflicting federal project, a reserve, actually a refuge, a national refuge. And over time, how they were supposed to operate it, they kind of stopped doing it. Initially, if you look at the actual conservation easements, it was very clear that they were going to farm half of the property one year and fallow the other half, and then flip those the following year and just keep flipping those. So that was in the 40s when they created the refuge. 20 years later, and by the 1960s, nobody's really paying attention anymore. And so they stopped doing that. And today it has a forest in it that is reducing the flood capacity. And that backs up water north of there and then starts putting constraints south as you head towards the Delta as well. And the board, I forget how much money they spent, it was a lot, but they did modeling. It was out at the request of the local landowners to do modeling, and sure enough, it showed the loss of capacity that exists. And the reason the discussion came up at my board yesterday was because, as I've told you, we have regions that are currently, the locals are trying to develop regional flood protection plans and projects that they want to do. And one of the things that the state has brought forward in like their statewide thing is possibly widening of that Sutter bypass. And the locals said, wait a second. This bypass was created for flood control, yet we have this other project being done for another purpose, which has now reduced the capacity. We're not meeting the 1957 design anymore. What can we do to get back to meeting that design and then see if we need to widen the bypass? It should function first. And so then the conversation, of course, led to the YOLO bypass and all these projects that will go on for water conveyance mitigation permits that are required. And that's a 50-year permit in the case of the BDCP. So it's that over time that you just really worry, do you end up losing that capacity? And why it's really important to have the board. So I really do appreciate that, but I do hope that at some point you'll include the reclamation districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Terry.